All right, Lloyd. How did you become a small business advocate?
How did I become a small business advocate?
Yeah.
Let me think. I think the first thing I did was back in the late 80s. My father was a contracting officer for the Air Force up in Sacramento. And I'd gone to work for a little computer company in Northern California, and he told me to do a Freedom of Information request for the small business subcontracting plan on different Pentagon contracts to see if there were opportunities for small businesses. And I was very naive and didn't, understand any of it. But I did a Freedom of Information request for the small business subcontracting plan on the F-22 stealth fighter. At that point in time, the law said small businesses were supposed to get 20% and minority businesses were supposed to get 5%. So I got the piece of paper. They refused to give it to me until after the contract was officially awarded. I think Northrop and Lockheed were bidding on it. I think it was called the YF-23 or something like that, but it was the F-22 stealth fighter. So after the contract was awarded, they gave me a copy of the plan, and I saw that the small business contracting goal was 16/100%, and the law said 20. I called the guy up. I thought it was a typo, and he said nope, 16/100%, and the minority goal was supposed to be 5, was 1/100%, and I was shocked. So at that time, Barbara Boxer was our representative, and I had met her, and I contacted her office and showed her what I had. She put me in touch with Les Aspin, who was the chair of the House Armed Services Committee back then. And I worked with his staff for a few days, and they did a congressional hearing on the F-22 stealth fighter contract. And as a result of that investigation, the Air Force and Lockheed were forced to allocate an additional $500 million. So it went from, I think the contract was like 8-something billion, the initial phase. It went from $16 million to $517 million. So off of, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 weeks worth of work, I got an additional $500 million for small businesses. And I thought, well, that wasn't so hard, right? So I did a Freedom of Information request on the B-2 bomber, I think it was, the C-17 transport, and some contract for Laurel. Well, the Pentagon figured out what I was going to do with the information, so they decided at that point in time that it was top secret, and they refused to give it to me. And we lost at the district court level to a federal judge named Vukasin, who I heard his brother was a high-ranking Pentagon official. The judge should have, it's called recused yourself, but the word is, he should have bowed out of that case because there was a conflict of interest, but he didn't. And that took several years. We went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we won a resounding victory in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And it was pretty shocking. The judges yelled at the Pentagon's attorney to the extent that she started crying hysterically. And it was really kind of surreal. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is pretty impressive. The judges are sitting up on this kind of a raised pedestal, and there's a lot of people in the room. And that the courtroom presentations were very dramatic. And it was very uplifting to hear the judges screaming at the Pentagon's lawyer. They said that this should have never been allowed to get this far. They told her, your job is supposed to be protecting the people, and you're protecting these companies that are, cheating the public, whatever. And I remember as I walked out of the courtroom, she walked out behind me and walked down the hallway to the left, and she had a big square briefcase like a pilot would have that had big square flaps on it, and she was just crying her eyes out. And I remember feeling very strong and powerful that I just beat the Pentagon in federal court, made their lawyer cry. And then I read they issued their ruling about, 3 weeks later, and I can't remember all of it, but what I remember was that the judge's ruling said that our lawsuit was consistent with the congressional intent in passing both the Freedom of Information Act and the Small Business Act, and would encourage government contractors to set higher small and small disadvantaged business contracting goals, which to me was very uplifting. Clearly, it was in the public good. I think after that, contracts for small businesses went up, noticeably because of the all the attention that lawsuit got. And I remember watching Dennis Miller talk about it in his HBO comedy special. He said something about, because of this company in California, the Freedom of Information Act is now free. And that was surprising. And it got a lot of media attention. It was picked up in a lot of newspapers. And one thing a lot of people don't know, but as a result of that lawsuit, we began talking to the Clinton administration. And I want to say her name was Karen Mills, who was Vince Foster's secretary in the White House. And President Clinton ended up issuing a new federal policy to all federal agencies based on that lawsuit, encouraging all federal agencies to release more information. And Vince Foster's secretary sent me a copy of the president's log from that day that showed that he had done that. They sent me a copy of the letter he sent Janet Reno. They sent me a copy of the letter Janet Reno sent the heads of all federal agencies. And it was very surprising, to get that kind of, result. But it was very uplifting. But that was I think that lawsuit ended in 1991. So that was probably my first lawsuit against the government. And we won that in 91. And that sort of set the ball rolling. And it kind of showed me how easy it was, quite frankly. It wasn't all that hard. The lawsuit took a long time, but we got our money back. And one thing about that lawsuit, by the way, that was actually kind of chilling is, and this is true, it sounds kind of strange, but let's say we won the lawsuit on Monday, and on Tuesday, an attorney for the federal government called me, and he said, you should be proud of yourself. That was a great lawsuit. It's going to help out a lot of people. He said, let's get to work now getting you your money back. I thought, okay, great, this is going to be easy. And then about 4 or 5 days later, he called again. And it was a most unusual phone call I've had my whole life, even up until now. He sounded like he had been beaten. And he was, I would say, sobbing a little bit. And he read, you could tell he was reading something. And he read this note to me and said something like, if you think you're going to get your money back, you've got another thing coming. You're going to have to file another lawsuit for every piece of paper you get from the Pentagon, and some things like that. But the strange thing was, here this government attorney calls me on Monday telling me I should be proud of myself. It was a great lawsuit, helped a lot of people. And 3 or 4 days later, he literally sounded like he'd been beaten, because he was sobbing on the phone, like a child. Ever been around a child when they cry and they kind of can't catch their breath, how they kind of make that funny sound that kids make when they're crying? He was doing that, and reading this note that was a complete antithesis of what he had said, and that was actually kind of scary. And I'll never forget that. That was the scariest phone call I've ever had in my whole life. But we ended up getting all of our money because Barbara Boxer and Don Feinstein knew Janet Reno, and they contacted her, and we eventually got our money back. And somewhere around the building is this great big giant check we blew up when the government had to pay our legal fees for the lawsuit. So that was my first experience as a small business advocate. That was, what was that, 20-something years ago? So that's my answer to that question.